This belief in the nothingness of necessity and in the underworld becomes belief in heaven, because the departed self must unite with its universality, must explicate in this universality what it contains, and thus become clear to itself. This kingdom of faith, however, we saw unfold its content only in the element of thought without the concrete notion, and for that reason perish in its fate, that is, in the religion of the enlightenment. In this religion, the supersensible beyond of the understanding is reinstated, but in such a way that self-consciousness remains satisfied in this world, and the supersensible empty beyond which is neither to be known nor feared, it knows neither as a self nor as a power. Paragraph 675 continues this exposition on Hegel's part, recapping the previous discussions of religion. Now we're looking just at the spirit section of the work, and we're actually looking in this paragraph at the middle portion, which is quite long, the culture section, which was broken into the self-alienated spirit, which then ended up talking about faith, right? And the section that we call the enlightenment, which then feeds into the morality section after freedom and the terror. So we've got a lot going on in those sections, but Hegel addresses this. He's really eager to get into the religion section proper, so he's not going to dwell on the many paragraphs in which he discussed this. So he says, this belief in the nothingness of necessity and in the underworld, okay, that was in the ethical order, right? The nothingness of necessity, fate, right? All of that sort of stuff. That was, as he talked about it, a universal that doesn't have a self. And then we do have selves in the religion of the underworld, or the religion of the dead, who we acknowledge, love, keep with us. But in the previous passage, he just said, listen, you don't have the kind of universality and agency that you need there either for a genuine religion in the sense that Hegel's going to spell out here. So that's going to give way as we move into the culture section. The belief in this, the Glaube, right, the faith in that, is going to give way to a different kind of belief. What kind of belief? Belief in heaven. And we could say that is, in some respect, a throwback to the unhappy consciousness, couldn't we? But that's not what he says here. Instead, he says, listen, in the self-alienated spirit part, where we are talking about faith and its opposition to various different things in the dialectic, that faith becomes a belief in heaven. And within heaven, how do we picture it to ourselves? This is where, a little digression could be useful. I've often said to my classes, if you think about heaven the way that it gets depicted in cartoons, it looks like an incredibly boring place that really nobody would want to go to, except for people who are desperate for living on, or people who really like sitting around in clouds with harps and wings and halos and all that other sort of accoutrements. I was going to say nonsense, but maybe some people believe in that sort of thing. Heaven can be understood in much more robust ways, and in Christianity, which is really what Hegel's focusing on here in the West, depictions of heaven really were quite well worked out. You could think of, Dante's Divine Comedy as an example, or all the great iconography of the Divine Liturgy taking place in heaven, or all these depictions within writings of theologians about what heaven is going to be like. They're none of that namby-pamby stuff. It's all a depiction of being with other people and being able to truly be with other people, where your wills aren't contradicting each other because you're all willing, things that are harmonious. So he says here, the departed self must unite with its universality, must explicate in this universality what it contains, and thus become clear to itself. That is a very, very different conception of life after death and a religious orientation towards the beloved dead than what we had in the underworld. Hegel calls this a nothingness, a nichts, right? Heaven is something where now, as we see here, he says, the departed self explicates what it contains and becomes clear to itself. It realizes what it is. So that's an advance. There is something going on there. Then he says, this kingdom of faith, however, we saw unfold its content only in the element of thought without the concrete notion. There's still something, at least for Hegel, not well worked out enough about this notion of heaven and the development or freedom of the self within heaven and what, is actually going on there. There's something missing in the picture. And so we get, like he says, it perishes in its own fate, that is, in the religion of the Enlightenment. And, we often depict to ourselves the Enlightenment as a time where we turned against religion, right? And there is this struggle of enlightenment with superstition. That's not the same thing as ruling out religion altogether. The Enlightenment really did have its own religion. And, very often this was phrased in terms of a deism. You've got a creator God who sets everything in motion in terms of the physical elements and the cosmos, but also inscribes a moral law within the very framework or fabric, not only of the universe, but of the human being. Kant's, religion within the limits of reason alone would be a prime example of this, but so would Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason, which is a tract on deism, So would so many other things like that. And that's, a viable option for people at a certain point in time. Now, what happens with that shift? So Hegel says, in this religion, in the religion of the Enlightenment, the supersensible beyond of the understanding is reinstated. So we're going back now a couple paragraphs to talking about this supersensible beyond, right? But here something's kind of interesting. So he's actually kind of blurring two things together. We have the supersensible, this is referring back to paragraph 673, the eternal or whatever else it may be is devoid of self, right? And then we had the beyond, but where was the beyond? In the unhappy consciousness, where there was now self creeping in. So he says the supersensible beyond is reinstated, but there's a key difference here. In such a way that self-consciousness remains satisfied in this world. So all of these religious themes about transformation, about attaining heaven, they become part of the driving force of the Enlightenment. And the idea is we can do it here. We don't need to displace it off to some future that may never come or something beyond death. And so he says this supersensible, empty beyond, which is neither to be known nor feared, it knows neither as a self nor as a power. So something gets left out that was traditionally there, and now the Enlightenment says that's just nonsense. Don't worry about that. We're going to have a positive conception of what heaven could look like, the kingdom of heaven here on earth. We're going to build it ourselves. As we've seen, that doesn't really actually happen, despite humankind's best efforts to realize it. And so, at the end of this paragraph, we're left with this empty beyond, which is now not really being recognized as an important part of the process. In the religion of morality, the fact that absolute being is a positive content is at last again recognized, but the content is bound up with the negativity of the Enlightenment. It is a being that is at the same time taken back into the self in which it remains shut up, and a differentiated content whose parts are just as immediately negated as they are produced. The fate, however, which engulfs this contradictory movement is the self, which is conscious of itself as the fate of what is essential and actual. Paragraph 676 is continuing this progression down what we can call memory lane of the Phenomenology of Spirit, where religion has been partially developed. It's played a role in the phenomenology and the dialectic. And now we're talking about the third part of the Spirit section of the work, the largest portion of the work. We're looking at the religion of morality, what has been attained from Hegel's perspective in all of those back and forth developments and discussions. So he says, in the religion of morality, we have something recognized. What is being recognized? The fact that absolute being, Wesen here, is a positive content. Now, we should pause for a second. What does that mean? Absolute being is a positive content. Well, okay, so religion is dealing with the ultimate, the eternal, the super sensible, whatever it's going to be, something pretty damn important. And what does it mean for it to be? We can talk about it having a positive content, but here he doesn't just say it has a positive content, it is a positive content. What does that mean? That means that it is manifested for us in something that is not super sensible, something that we can not just visualize, but tangibly encounter. And that's because it's us. It's us and the society that we're in that's being taken as the object, right? So it has a positive content, but then he says it's also bound up with the negativity of the Enlightenment. Okay, so what's the negativity of the Enlightenment? Well, there was a danger in the Enlightenment that it was just going to engage in critique. Going back to an earlier discussion in the phenomenology, where faith is encountering enlightenment and losing in the process because it's being construed as superstition. The Enlightenment does a good job and looks very good to people attracted to it and also to itself when it has an enemy, when it has something to critique. And that critique can very easily spill back upon itself and lead to a kind of perfectionism within this world, a more dangerous perfectionism, as we've seen, than that of traditional religious perfectionism, right? That's part of the negativity of the Enlightenment. It's continually moving forward, but what is it moving forward into? What is it developing? So we have this polarity between negative and positive here, right? He goes on and he says, it's a being that is at the same time taken back into the self in which it remains shut up, and a differentiated content whose parts are just as immediately negated as they are produced. Well, that sounds pretty bad then, doesn't it, right? So there's this constant churning of new ideas being proposed, new ways of doing things, and at the same time, people are looking for something they can really latch onto, right? And here's where we get to the end of it, where there's a really very interesting discussion here about fate, the fate which engulfs this contradictory movement. Now, he actually doesn't say it engulfs the contradictory movement. Rather, the contradictory movement sinks into that fate, sinks into that destiny, whatever that happens to be. And now that fate itself is getting a kind of a positive content, right? Because in the past, right, fate was selfless. Fate was just what it was, and it confronted us like something alien. And now we get to understand that, no, we are not just pawns of fate or even agents of fate. We are the agents producing the fate. And that puts a terrible responsibility upon our shoulders, right? So he says the fate which engulfs this contradictory movement is the self, which is conscious of itself as the fate of what is essential and actual. And what is essential and actual? We could just say essentiality and actuality, Wesenheit and Wirklichkeit. These are somehow being brought together here. Usually we only get one and we don't get the other, right? You get Wesenheit, but then you don't get Wirklichkeit. Essentiality without actuality, or you get actuality without essentiality. Here we're getting both, and it's through a self that is conscious of its own involvement in this process as what is producing and then living out that fate. The self-knowing spirit is, in religion, immediately its own pure self-consciousness. Those forms of it which have been considered, that is, the true spirit, the self-alienated spirit, and the spirit that is certain of itself, together constitute spirit in its consciousness, which, confronting its world, does not recognize itself therein. But in conscience, it brings itself, as well as its objective world in general, into subjection, as also its picture thinking and its specific notions, and is now a self-consciousness that communes with its own self. In this, spirit conceived as object has for itself the significance of being the universal spirit that contains within itself all essence and all actuality. Yet, it is not in the form of free actuality or the apparent independence of nature. True, it has a shape or the form of being in that it is the object of its consciousness, but because in religion consciousness is posited essentially in the determination of self-consciousness, the shape is perfectly transparent to itself, and the reality it contains is shut up in it and superseded in it just the same way as when we speak of all reality. It is universal reality as thought. Paragraph 677 carries us to the very end of the morality section, the final part of it, conscience. And Hegel tells us what has been achieved in that. And, when you read this paragraph, it's a little bit hard to map that onto those, twists and turns and final paragraphs of the conscience section, but we'll see what we can do with it anyway. So he tells us the self-knowing spirit is in religion immediately its own pure self-consciousness, right? So we've had this self-knowing spirit, and now in this religion section, it's supposed to be a pure self-consciousness. What does that mean? Is it a self-consciousness that's pure by being decoupled from other self-consciousnesses? That can't be the case, because we know that self-consciousness has to exist in relation to other self-consciousnesses. So maybe the purity lies in its relation to itself. Well, let's go on. So he says the forms of it which have been considered, and then he says, okay, the true spirit, meaning the ethical spirit, right, the early part of the spirit section, the self-alienated spirit, in which we saw all of this development going on with thought and faith and the enlightenment and all of that sort of thing culminating in freedom and the terror. And then finally, the spirit that is certain of itself. These three are all, he says, constituting spirit in its consciousness. Now, constituting spirit in its consciousness, they're sort of summing up what are the possibilities for spirit, as well as showing us a development. And what's key to all of them, but is different about the conscience shape of consciousness, is that they are all oriented towards, they confront, he says, a world. Now, this is not a world that's simply a natural environment, as in, say, observing reason. It is a humanized world, a social world, a world of others, and a world in which it doesn't, as he says, the spirit in its consciousness does not recognize itself in that world. Now, the word that he's using that Miller's translating here as recognize is erkennen, right? It's not anerkennen. It's just the word that we use for like, I know that. I recognize that song. I recognize this road that we're going down. So it doesn't recognize, it doesn't know who it is in that world. It doesn't recognize its own contribution to the situation that it's confronting. So he says, in conscience, moving into this final progression and stage, you could say, shape of consciousness. In conscience, it brings itself as well as its objective world in general, gegenständliche Welt, right? So it's got a different relation to the world. It's bringing the world and itself now into something. Into what? Into subjection. As well as its picture thinking and its specific notions. Now, isn't that a weird thing to say? So it's bringing itself and the world into subjection, and these two different modes of communication, thinking, articulation, picture thinking, Vorstellung, right? And specific notions. He's using the word Begriffe there, right? So notions that have been made, the notions that have been specified, that have been made particular, besonderes, right? So it's doing an awful lot, isn't it? This conscience. And it's understanding itself in a different way. And he says, it is now a self-consciousness that communes with its own self. Where did we see that in the conscience section? Did we really see it communing with its own self? I guess by the end we did. And he does talk about God in that respect, right? But we've been mostly dealing with these dualities and antitheses running throughout that section. So he goes on and he says, in this, in what? In how conscience is bringing all these things into subjection, spirit conceived as object has for itself the significance of being. Now here he talks about the universal spirit that contains within itself all essence, Wesenheit, and all actuality, Wirklichkeit. Now, and he says something really important here. So if it contains all essence and actuality, that sounds like it is totalizing. It actually should be absolute spirit, not just universal spirit, shouldn't it? We were talking about absolute spirit just a little bit earlier in the end of the morality section and in the beginning of this section, weren't we? But it's universal spirit. There's something that's actually not being realized here. It may contain or extend to or try to dominate all essence and actuality, but it doesn't actually do so, right? Why not? Because there's a certain kind of actuality that is not being taken into account here. He says, it is not in the form of, what? Free actuality. And then he says, or the apparent independence of nature. It's lacking something. Even if it seems to extend, and it doesn't clearly extend to, all essence and actuality, insofar as it's not yet free, it doesn't. So he goes on and he says, true, it has shape or the form of being, in that it is the object of its consciousness, right? Conscience, this reconciled, harmonized, reciprocally recognizing polarity that we saw in the end. It has that as the object of its consciousness. And then Hegel says, but because in religion consciousness is posited essentially in the determination of self-consciousness, the shape is perfectly transparent to itself, and the reality it contains is shut up in it and superseded in it, just as the same way as when we speak of all reality. Well, what does that mean? When we talk about all reality, this is, in a way we can think about this in going beyond Hegel, we can think of this in a Heideggerian way. Heidegger tells us at a number of points, we're never grasping the totality of being. It just doesn't happen, except through something like mood, right? With Hegel, he says, no, we can grasp it. We can't grasp it as actuality. We can grasp it in a different mode. Universal reality as thought. If it's mere thought, though, that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? In the Hegelian dialectic, we always see, at least in the phenomenology, that if something is just a thought, it's not yet what it needs to be. Notions even might be underdeveloped or not fully realized. They attain that through our action in the world, our comportment, our relations to others. And so now you could ask, well, what does all this have to do with religion? Well, he's bringing us to the end of this short discussion of all the places where religion has popped up before and why those, however interesting and illuminating they've been, are not precisely what he's going to be discussing in the passages yet to come, where he's doing the positive development. Not too far from this, just a few pages after this, he is actually going to get us into natural religion, right? The first set of new dialectics. And so do we get that from the previous developments in self-consciousness, spirit? No, we're not getting that yet. But we will see these developments soon. And so we're kind of meandering into figuring out, well, what the hell is religion then? We thought we knew what it was. Now we have to kind of, expand the notion, unpack it, let it develop, be good phenomenologists, see what's going on. We were doing something kind of like that in conscience, but we only grasped it in a certain way and as thought. So we don't yet have the religion that we're seeking.